This afternoon, Louise Singleton and Katie Ansari will provide an overview of HNES, Sam Hales will discuss the application process, and then Louise and Alison Sanders will explain the assessment process. I'll then discuss the support available to applicants and end with a Q&A. I'll hand over now to Louise and Katie.
Thank you very much, Sasha. So hi everyone, I'm Louise Singleton. I'm the HNES Programme Manager at GemServe. Just to give you a bit of context of where HNES sits within the Heat Networks Transformation Programme within the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So as you can see, there are a number of different grant schemes available to help build new heat networks and also support the improvement of existing heat networks. So within the transformation programme, it originally started with the Heat Networks Delivery Unit back in 2013. We then had the Heat Network Investment Project, or HNIP, which was designed to help support the growth of new heat networks, and that was replaced with the Green Heat Network Fund in 2023. And then we ran the HNES demonstrator from 2021 to 2022, which was just one funding round. And then using the learnings from that, we then launched HNES proper in 2023, February. And it's basically designed to help existing heat networks, both district and communal, to improve the efficiency and improve the outcomes for customers. So go to the next slide. So like I say, there are three objectives for HNES. The first is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. The second one, and this is something that was a bit of a change from the demonstrator into the main scheme, we obviously, within that time, we had the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis, and so we have increase the importance, I guess, of the second objective, which is around reducing customer detriment to improve consumer confidence. So really making sure that with the government's aim to increase the number of heat networks to about 20% of market share by 2050, we want to make sure that customers on existing heat networks are having a good experience. And so HNES is there to help improve the experience of customers on heat networks that aren't necessarily performing as well as they can do. And then finally, number three is around helping the heat network market prepare for sector regulation and technical standards. So that includes the introduction of the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme and also things like zoning that are coming forward as well. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of funding, we have two funding pots. We have revenue grants and we have capital grants. So for revenue, this is essentially designed for heat network operators who know their heat network isn't performing particularly well, but they don't know why. So it's to fund optimization studies, which are undertaken by an external consultant, third party, to come in and have a look and really sort of lift the lid on the heat network and identify any issues it's experiencing and provide recommendations for how the heat network can be improved. In terms of funding availability for that, we have £2 million awarded to us for 23-24 and 24-25, and there's further funding anticipated for the next two financial years as well. On the capital side, this is part funding. So for the revenue grants, we have a budget of between sort of £15,000 to £24,000 for an optimization study, and that will be fully funded through HNES. But on the capital side, we can fund up to, but not including, 50% of the overall costs of the capital works. And this is to cover the installation of eligible measures, which we'll talk through a little later. And in terms of the pot for that, there is up to £75 million available out to the financial year 27-28. For this round, for round 8, capital projects will be able to apply for funding in next financial year, 25-26, and also for 26-27. And for revenue projects, they'll be able to apply for funding in 25-26. However, it's worth noting this funding is subject to availability, but as I say, we fully anticipate that there will be funding available. Grant funding must be spent within its allocated financial year. So if you're applying for capital projects and you're requesting funding across the 2 financial years, you must spend your awarded funding within the financial year that you've requested it in. But if you have match funding from a capital perspective, in particular, you do not have to spend that at the same time as the grant funding. It's just making sure that at the end of the project, the grant is not more than 50% of the overall project costs. Go to the next slide. So in terms of who can apply, so the scheme's open to both district and communal heat networks, but they must be existing, they can't be in development. The heat networks can be situated in England or Wales. And in terms of applicants, we have a wide range of applicants from the public sector, private sector, third sector, housing associations, education facilities, hospitals, basically anyone that has an existing heat network and has the authority to sign off on the investment decisions for the heat network that they're responsible for can apply. So we can't have, for example, a consultant applying on behalf of a heat network operator for a revenue study, for example. It would need to be the heat network operator themselves who applies. Go to the next slide. So in terms of the funding round, so for this round 8 that we're talking about, the closing date for applications is the 8th of November. In order to apply, you need to upload your application into a dedicated SharePoint space that we will issue you out a link to. The last day to request a SharePoint space is the 1st of November, so that's a week before the Friday. And that's just to make sure that there's enough time for us to set up the SharePoint spaces and for you to test that the link works, that you can get access, so that we're not scrambling around on the 8th of November trying to get people able to submit their applications. So if you would like to apply in round 8, please can you email hnes@gemserve.com with your request no later than the 1st of November. We do expect there to be further funding rounds. We just don't have the dates for those yet. So round 8 is definitely not the last funding round. So we fully expect to be running round 9 onwards from next year. We have updated the application forms for round 8. So we'll be on version 8 for capital applications and version 6 for revenue applications. The application forms are in the final stages of being finalised, so we expect them to be available very soon. But if you are looking to apply and would like an application form, again, please email hnes@gemserve.com. The email address will be on the slides later. The changes aren't massively significant. It's mainly just the financial years that you can apply for, and a bit of sort of formatting and things. But yeah, there's for people that have had access to the previous application forms, they are substantially similar to those ones. So if you are looking to start completing your application ahead of the new forms being available, you can do so on the previous, or you can base it off the previous versions, but we just require you to submit the current versions when you do submit for round 8. We will also be updating the guidance document, which has all the information you need about the scheme and how to apply. And again, we hope that will be uploaded in the next few days as well. Okay, in terms of eligibility criteria, so for capital grants, we cover everything from the energy centre through to the tertiary network, and also some metering. However, there are some notable exclusions within that range. So again, in the guidance document, we have a list of all things that are eligible, but it's probably easier to say things that aren't eligible, as I've done on these slides. But yeah, if you have any questions about your specific project and you'd like more some clarity on whether you think whether what you're applying for is eligible, then please do get in touch after the webinar. But things we can't fund, so any capital costs that have already been incurred prior to an HNES award having been made. So any works that are being done before we tell you that you have been awarded grant funding, we won't be able to fund. Anything that's not related to the heat network infrastructure, so improvements to building fabric, for example, are not eligible. Anything to do with engagement activities such as stakeholder management or internal project management are not eligible. Within the energy centre itself, we're not able to fund cost for replacing the primary heat generation source. So yeah, if you were looking to replace boilers or things like that, we can't fund any of that. But we can fund other things within the energy centre, such as replacement pipe work, controls, insulation, things like that. On the tertiary system side, we aren't able to fund anything sort of dwelling side of the HRU. So anything to do with replacing pipe work or heat emitters within the building would not be eligible. And finally, under metering, any requirement under the heat network metering and billing regulations to install meters, if you have that requirement, we are not able to fund your metering, as this is a legal requirement and you should be doing that anyway, and shouldn't be asking for shouldn't be getting that funded through the public purse. So if you are exempt or you have done the cost effectiveness tool and it says it's not cost effective to install metering, then that would be eligible. But if you are required to install meters, then we cannot fund those. Next slide. Thank you. For revenue grants, so again, within our guidance document, we have Annex A, which lists out what we expect to see from an optimization study. So if you are looking to apply for a revenue grant, I'd advise you have a read over that so you're familiar with what we are looking for from one of those studies. But in terms of things that are ineligible, as with the capital cost, anything that's incurred before the funding award is made cannot be funded. Any internal applicant staffing, so for example, project managing your consultant would not be covered, and anything relating to construction, operation, and maintenance of a heat network, because that would sit outside of your optimization study spec. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Katie now, who's going to talk you through a bit more about what we expect to see from a optimization study.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm just going to talk a bit about what we require in the optimization report. This is mostly for the revenue projects after the optimization study has been completed. So in work package 1, the aim is to investigate and assess the network's current operational performance and the conditions of the network as well, in order to develop a baseline, which the optimization measures will be developed. And then we can quantify this information ready for work package 2. This is so that the heat network operator understands the causes of the suboptimal performance and the impact this has on the operation of the network and its customers. The steps include data capture and site visits. We would advise for the site visits, we do require pictures, some diagrams and descriptions of the heat network, along with the baseline data of the network performance and KPIs. It must cover the assessment of the whole network as well, including the architecture and the plant room energy centre, primary, secondary and tertiary network, if that's applicable. The KPIs will form the basis for considering the benefits and the cost effectiveness of the proposed optimization recommendations, which is what is going to be proposed for work package 2. So then on to the next step, please. Next slide, sorry. Work package 2, the aim for this one is to identify the potential optimization measures and quantify the costs and impacts that implementing these can have on the network performance. In this, the heat network operator will receive a report with a robust analysis of the recommendations offered and show a course of action to improve the operational performance and customer outcomes. The steps for this would be to develop the optimization measures and packages of the measures. Number 2 is doing a rundown of the cost and the cost effectiveness of the optimization packages. And 3, reporting and recommendations. To show this, we'd also say for work package 2 that a table is required with the baseline data and the optimization measures combine to show any improvements. And then with the final deliverables, so overall we need the project report, which is baseline data, a summary of the site visit report, the techno-economic analysis spreadsheet. This should be in an unlocked Excel document, and it should include the breakdown of the costs, so going forward for the optimization measures. And then final submission of the revenue M&R worksheet, including the optimization study outputs annex. And you can also complete the capital grant application form as well if you have all the results that you wish for. And I think that's everything in terms of optimization reports. So I'll go on to what we have achieved so far. We've had 233 heat network projects that have been funded, £34.8 million awarded to capital and revenue funding, and over 43,000 residents that have benefited from this. And then the sectors that this has covered so far is housing associations, local authorities, charities, private sector, health sector, and education sector. You can see the map on the right of the locations and the areas that have been funded so far. And the main works that have been funded is the upgrading the pipework, improving the insulation, updating controls, replacing the HIUs, improving water quality, and reducing leaks. And then we have some images of and some data from the round 6 successful projects. So £2.7 million was awarded, and this was over 33 heat networks, and it's set to benefit over 1,900 residents. You can see in the top left corner there, it's Glenadel Housing, which is a revenue project, and in the top right, it's the Stello Buildings Management Company, which was a capital project. The bottom left is Exeter University, that was for revenue funding, and the bottom right is WISE Building, it's the Centre for Alternative Technology Charity, and that was a revenue project. You can click on the link at the bottom to read our other funded projects, and we will, as Sasha said earlier, share the slides after this session. I'm going to hand over now to Sam to discuss the application process.
Thank you. So just to follow on from what Katie said, I've just put a link to the GemServe HNES website in the chat. There you can also see all our press releases, as well as sign up to mailing lists, things like that. So you're able to go and see all the press releases on there and from all the previous rounds as well. So in terms of the application form, as Louise said, we are currently just finalising the new version for this round. However, it is largely the same as previous rounds. So if you've got one from a previous round, you can start to see what we're asking and start to pull that information together. And then we will again send out to our mailing lists and notifications via sort of all our LinkedIn channels, Twitter channels, etc. when the new ones are ready. And then again, anyone who's requested one saying they want to apply in this round will let you know when those new ones are available. It isn't wholesale changes. There are some changes around sort of funding years and some additional validation. So in terms of the forms, they're broken down into different tabs. So I'm going to run through each tab and give a little bit of an overview of what is on those. So tab A is the applicant information. So fingers crossed, to be honest, this is probably the easiest one to fill in for yourselves. This is filling in the information about your company, the one who's applying, and the contact information around the application. So hopefully a nice, straightforward, easy one. And then tab B is around the project information. So it's a description of the network, including the address of the network, some bits around the characteristics, including the proportion of dwellings that fall under the customers in need. So again, earlier in this webinar, I posted a chat to the HNES guidance on the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero's website. In there, it will tell you exactly what the customer need definition is. Again, the application form next that question lists what that is, so that you can easily let us know how many fall under that category. And then there's questions around some of the regulatory bits around sort of heat trust regulation, heat network metering and billing regulations, and so on. And then moving on to tab C, the project narrative. So this is, a lot of this is sort of free text fields. So this is the bit that's really helpful as a project if you go into a lot of detail about the network, what you want to do, what you think it will achieve, what are the issues currently. This is the bit to really tell the assessors about your network. They obviously are coming into this with no ideas about or no knowledge of your network. So this is the point when you can really sell them on what the problems are, how you're going to address them, why you need the funding, and all of that. So the more detail you can put in there, the easier it makes it for the assessor to find that information and hopefully and score against it. And it should hopefully reduce the amount of clarifications we have to come back to you to ask about. So the more you can fill that out, the better. So moving on to tab D. Tab D is the baseline and target information. So this is filling out a lot more on the metrics. So tab C was a lot more free text and you can tell us about it. Tab D is a lot more of metrics, and this is going through some hopefully slightly more basic bits around how much fuel's imported, things like that, how much energy is being generated, as well as some more complicated metrics that are in there as well, around sort of heat demands, heat losses, and then there's other ones around sort of network outages, service interruptions. On this tab, the more you can fill in, the better. There are a lot of metrics on there. We don't expect projects to fully complete that tab. And again, we're aware that often projects who apply for HNES funding might have less information than more modern networks. And that's part of why they need to apply for HNES, is they can't necessarily see what's going on the network and therefore how to fix it. So you're not penalised for not providing it. However, obviously we can't score against it if we don't have it as well. So the more you can provide on that tab, the better. So please do put as much detail into it as you possibly can. Tab E goes into the funding and procurement. So here you'll tell us how much you want to apply for, and the fund, and how much of that, how much is the total project cost and how much you want to apply for. For capital applications, it's broken down into sort of different network areas so that you can show us how you're spending the money within that total. With revenue projects where it's just a optimization study, we just ask for that. There is an additional line to break out things like VAT on the revenue one as well. And then for both of them, there's the procurement. So descriptions around procurement milestones, if you have contracts in place already, all those sort of bits. And then finally, tab F is a place where you can confirm that you've uploaded everything, and that you've completed. There's some applicant declarations around there around double subsidy, things like that. So you can confirm that you comply with those. And as I say, there is some supporting evidence that you need to upload. So if we can move on to the next slide. The revenue grants I'll run through first, because everything that's applicable basically to revenue grants is applicable to capital grants, and then capital build on it further. So I'll start with revenue grants. So revenue grants are the optimization studies. So when you apply, we'd want evidence of application costs through quotes, and then we'd want signed a signed letter or letters confirming, and we've got the bullet points down there. And again, it's in the guidance online, but around the support for the application and works, match funding if relevant. So on revenue grants, they can be fully funded, and we'd expect most revenue grants to be up to £24,000. However, it's worth noting you can, if your network is particularly complicated, you can ask for additional amounts, but we'd need that justification. And again, it might be that your works you expect to cost more, but you aren't able to justify any more funding requests or something like that. So you could match fund as well. So that's why it's if relevant, but we'd expect most to be falling in to that up to £24,000 mark. And then acceptance of monitoring and reporting requirements, as well as the confirmations of any other subsidies for the project, and again, confirmation that you're not having double subsidy. We'd expect an outline of the project program as well as a completed AP1A form. So the AP1A form is something when your master application pack will provide to you, and this provides your bank details to us so that if you are awarded funding, we're able to pay it out to you. So as I say, that's the revenue grants, and the capital grants build on that. So in terms of that, all that I've run through is still relevant. We'd also need, where applicable, confirmation and evidence of the eligibility of metering costs. So as Louise said at the start, this is around the heat network metering and billing regulations, as we obviously can't fund stuff that is a legal requirement. And again, something that is worth noting is we do need, again, those sort of application costs, supporting quotes for all the works to be able to justify your funding ask. The better detail you can provide, the more confidence obviously there is in the project delivery. So moving on to the next slide for me, please. Under sort of HNES, there is some bits around applying for multiple projects. So for revenue grants, if you're submitting multiple applications in the same funding round, we would expect the applicant to be able to explain to us in the application how these projects are different, and why they need 2 studies. So you are able to apply for 2 studies, but we want to know why they're different and why learning from one can't be taken across into the other. We don't want to fund 2 studies of identical networks where the learnings could be moved across from one to the other. We want to be able to get to the most networks and benefit the most networks possible. And then if you're submitting an application for a revenue grant, and you've already been awarded funding in the past for a revenue grant, we'd want, again, just a bit of an explanation why the learnings from the previous studies that you've been funded for can't be applied to a new application. So again, if they are, different engineering designs, they've got different suboptimal performance indicators, things like that, obviously they mean that they are different studies, and we therefore we'll be able to judge if we believe they're different studies well, and then apply or award funding, hopefully, if they are different. But if they're the same, we'd be saying, no, you should be able to move or use the learnings that you've already got. And then again, with capital grants, if you're applying for multiple in the same round, it's worth noting that obviously if you are going into big capital works, there may be lessons learned on the projects, and it might be worth looking at could these capital works be done one after another, so that you can take the learnings from one and use it on the other, rather than doing them in parallel and running into the potentially same sort of issues, things like that, if they're in parallel. So it doesn't mean you can't apply, but it's worth considering the sequencing of the capital works. And again, sort of similar to the revenue grants, if you've already had a capital grant funded, we'd like you to explain how you're going to take those learnings from the previous sort of capital works and incorporate them into that new application. So again, if you've found you come up against problems, how in this new application for this new heat network you're going to overcome these issues ahead of time, and you're not going to run into them again. So yeah, as it says in the text at the bottom, we actively encourage capital applications for heat networks that have previously been awarded revenue funding. The aim for us is that heat networks get the revenue grant, they're able to find out what's wrong with their network, and then we really want to see them convert into a capital application, actually go and fix the problems, make a difference to the residents, and reduce carbon emissions. So we actively encourage people to go from revenue to capital grants. Obviously, if you've already had a study done outside of HNES, we'd accept that as evidence for capital grants, and that's welcomed just as much. So to submit an application, as we said, the application forms are being updated and the versions are on screen. Please express interest as early as possible in the future funding rounds. It helps us build a picture up of what's coming, and it also helps us support you if you have any queries or questions down the line. And then it also means that when you request SharePoint spaces, we're able to set them up ahead of time, and you haven't got the last minute scramble to try and submit. It makes it easier for you because you know you've got the spaces, you know you can submit, so it takes the pressure off, but it also means that it's easier from our side as well. You can request these spaces as early as you like. We will acknowledge obviously any requests that come in. However, we will look to set them up sort of a week and a half, 2 weeks, and just under a week before the deadline. So we will acknowledge a request, we will log it all, but we won't set it up straight away if you were to request it today. So I'm going to pass over to Louise and Alison to talk around the assessment process.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so the next section is just going to talk about how we score the applications that we receive. So starting with capital applications, there are 5 criteria that we assess. So first of all, we have deliverability. So we're looking at both cost certainty and delivery certainty. So cost certainty is you obviously submitted the grant amount that you're looking to that you would like us to award to you. We want to understand how have you arrived at that figure. Do you have quotations to support your request? Particularly, we are seeing for capital applications some quite large application requests. It's very important that we have the supporting quotations to justify that those grant asks. And on delivery certainty, it's looking at your project plan and when you expect to actually complete the works. The main reason for this is to make sure where you are requesting funding potentially in different financial years, how certain we are that the funding you've requested in one financial year will be drawn down in that particular financial year, and do we think that the timeframes that you've proposed are achievable and practical and things like that. So we would request a project plan to go alongside your application as supporting evidence. For network performance, so we have a number of metrics that we look at. So one is the how much do you expect to reduce the cost to the operator of delivering heat to the end customer? How much of an improved efficiency are you likely to see as a result of the works that you're undertaking? So that can be to do with heat losses, that can be to do with distribution efficiency. We have a section to do with unplanned outages or service interruptions. Do you expect that the measures you're undertaking will reduce the number of unplanned outages that you're experiencing? How much gas and electricity savings are you likely to achieve? It's worth noting that electricity savings don't have to necessarily be direct. They could be indirect as well. For example, if you're improving the performance of your pumps, that might mean that they are reducing the amount of electricity required to run. So it's worth calculating not just the savings from the sort of fuel that's being used to generate the heat, but also potential electricity savings as a result of improved performance of components within the heat network. And finally, the quality of the supporting information. So within the application form, we ask you to provide a baseline set of figures and a target set of figures. And we want to understand how have you arrived at those target figures, and again, how achievable do we think they are, how realistic do we think they are, and what's the sort of supporting information that you've got to justify those figures. So for example, if you have undertaken an optimization study, we would expect as a result of the optimization study your consultant to have provided some figures and benefits data, which can then be used to support your capital application. So we'd be looking for things like that. You don't have to have completed an HNES optimization study to apply for a capital application, but something comparable to justify your benefits data would be preferable. On the next slide, so the next three, we have our project narrative section. So this is essentially where you can write a lot of detail about your project and how it will align with our objectives, so around reducing carbon emissions and reducing customer detriment. And then the final section is around how you plan to disseminate any information that you achieve, or any learnings or information that you get from undertaking your capital project. So do you have other heat networks within your portfolio where you could take the learnings from undertaking these capital works and apply them to making improvements in other networks that you have? How do you engage with, or how will you engage with your customers during, before, during and after undertaking the works? And more broadly, how would you engage with the market, the wider market, to sort of talk about the experiences that you've had and the measures and steps that you've taken to improve the efficiency and the outcomes, I guess, that you've realised. For value for money, we look at the costs compared to the savings expected. So yeah, we basically look at how much grant are you asking for compared to the sort of level of savings we expect to see. So that's looking across carbon, gas and electricity. And then finally, we look at data availability and baselining. So how much energy meter data do you have available? How frequently is that data available? Do you have any operational data? How have you got your figures for your baseline? Just to try and help us understand how accurate the figures are that have been provided, and also again how you'll be able to measure any impacts of the measures that are being installed. So those are the 5 for capital. If we move on to revenue, again, so there's 3 in revenue, so they're similar to what I've spoken through for capital. So again, we have our project narrative section, so how you align with our objectives and how you will disseminate information. As Sam said, we are unlikely to fund multiple revenue applications for similar projects or similar heat networks within a operator's portfolio. So how will you use the information that you get from this particular study to maybe help to inform improvements on other networks that you may have, for example, or how will you work with other organizations that you may work with to help disseminate the information you receive in your reports to help other heat networks, again, for example. On deliverability, again, cost certainty, ideally we would like to see a quote or a number of quotes from different consultants. I've seen there's a question in the chat earlier about is there a list of approved consultants? We don't have a list of approved consultants. It's for the applicants to go out into the market and find a suitable consultant for them to use, and ideally provide some quotes to support their grant request. And again, from delivery certainty, we'd look to see a project plan outlining when you expect to start your study and complete it, to make sure you're requesting the funding in the right funding years. And then from data availability and baselining, again, as Sam said, we appreciate that particularly for revenue applications, the whole point of coming to HNES is that you might not have the data availability to help you understand how your network is performing. So it's not one of the sort of like heavily weighted scoring criteria, but we do look at the sort of availability that you do have, because obviously the more data you have available, the better it will be in terms of informing your consultant about how the heat network is operating. But yeah, it's not a deal breaker if you don't have the data. Okay, next slide. I think over to Alison.
Thank you. This slide gives an overview of the likely timescales for the round 8 assessment process and when you're likely to be notified whether your application is successful. Please be aware that the dates are indicative and may be subject to change. So in the table, you can see that weeks 1 to 9, from the 11th of November to the 24th of January, is the actual application assessment period. During this period, applications are checked and assessed and clarifications are raised with projects. Applicants are required to respond to these clarifications and answer any questions raised or provide additional information. There's some more information about clarifications on the next slide. Once the assessment process, could you just go back to the previous slide, please? Once the assessment process has been completed, the assessment outcomes are submitted to the HNES Investment Committee for review. The Investment Committee typically reviews the project assessments in weeks 10 to 13. During this review stage, the committee can also raise additional clarifications that applications will need to respond to. The Investment Committee then makes decisions about which projects to recommend for funding. The funding recommendations are then sent to the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero for approval, and this usually takes place in week 14 of the process. Once government approval has been given, in usually around week 15, applicants are notified whether their application is successful or not. So that means, according to the current estimates, around 8 applicants are likely to find out whether their application is successful around the first week in February. If the application is successful, in the case of non-local authority applicants, the grant funding agreement is issued for signature around week 15. And for local authority applicants, there's an additional Section 31 approvals process that they need to go through, and they're then issued with a memorandum of understanding for signature. And this process usually takes place in weeks 15 to 19. Next slide, please. Thank you. Clarifications are raised by the assessors during the assessment period, and applicants need to provide responses to these. And the deadlines are usually quite short as well. Clarifications are typically issued in weeks 1, 3, and 5. It's essential that the applicant is available during these weeks to ensure that they can provide full and timely responses to any clarifications. The Investment Committee may also raise clarifications and request further information from applicants, and this typically takes place in week 11. However, it's important to note that clarifications can be issued at any time during the assessment process, so from weeks 1 to 13. And the deadline for responses is often short. This means that it's important to make sure there's someone available throughout the assessment period, so that if the person responsible for the application is on leave or unavailable, other colleagues have been briefed and are able to respond. Next slide, please. If your application is successful, you'll need to submit monthly monitoring and reporting returns as a condition of the grant funding. The monitoring and returns are important for monitoring project progress and also for tracking when the grant funding will be spent and ensuring that the aims of the scheme are being met. You'll be provided with additional written guidance about the monitoring and reporting process if you're successful. The application pack also contains a blank template of the monitoring form, so please have a look at this to ensure that you're able to provide all the necessary information if your project is successful. The templates and reporting requirements for revenue and capital projects are slightly different. So the revenue projects are required to submit returns monthly from the month the grant funding agreement or memorandum of understanding is signed until the optimization study is signed off. The information you'll need to provide includes updates on how the project is progressing, any risks and issues affecting the project, and the expected grant drawdown profile. So that means when you'll expect to make your grant claims. The monitoring form also has a sheet that's filled in by your consultant on the final monitoring return once the optimization study has been completed. This is to show the outputs of the optimization study. For capital projects, they're also required to submit monthly monitoring returns from the month they sign their documents. And the monitoring returns are similar to the revenue returns, so you'll need to provide a project update and outline any risks and issues. And you'll also need to fill in the financial profile table, as well as showing when you expect to draw down the grant. This also includes a section for you to show when you expect to spend the match funding over the course of the project. On a quarterly basis, capital projects also need to fill in the data sheet on tab C of the monitoring return. This covers the previous 3 months and is used to measure the benefits and KPIs of the project. Once the works are complete, this for capital projects, they no longer need to submit the monthly returns, but they do need to keep sending in the quarterly data sheet every 3 months, and that needs to be completed for 24 months after project completion. So we advise capital and revenue projects to look at the monitoring returns before submitting an application to make sure you're familiar with the reporting requirements and that you'll be able to provide the necessary data. For example, on the quarterly returns, capital projects will need to provide monthly updates to the technical and economic data that they entered on tab D of the application form. So it's important to ensure that the person filling in the monitoring returns knows how the data was arrived at and has access to all the information. And next slide, please. So moving on to grant claims. If your project is successful, the process for making grant claims varies between non-local authority and local authority projects. So for all organisations that are not local authorities, grant funding can only be claimed retrospectively, so you'll need to provide evidence of spend before a grant claim can be paid. Evidence of spend includes invoices from contractors, and you'll also need to provide remittance evidence to show that invoices have been paid. To make a claim, you need to fill in the grant claim form and submit it along with the evidence of spend. Capital projects also need to provide evidence of spend for all the match funding that they've spent by the end of the project. Local authorities have a different process. They can claim the grant funding upfront as a lump sum once their memorandum of understanding has been signed, and then they just need to fill in the grant claim form to release the funding. Funding is released on a financial year basis, so funding is split over different financial years. Evidence has to be provided to show that the grant has been spent before the next year's grant can be claimed. Local authorities still need to provide evidence of all their project spend, including all grant and match funding by the end of the project, so you still need to supply all those invoices and proof of payment. If there's an underspend or if any funding isn't used in line with the grant award, local authorities will be required to pay back the relevant amount of grant. And next slide, please. And now handing over to Sasha.
Great, thanks, Alison. So you can access support from our pre-application support team to discuss the application process or to begin your application. So our team can provide a range of support, including initial contact and issue the application form, one-to-ones with our relationship managers, first pass review of the application with feedback, respond to your questions before submitting, and signposting that you're ready to submit your application. To discuss your project with one of our relationship managers, please email hnes.support@gemserve.com. Here you can see our lovely HNES team on screen. So these are a few reminders. So please email hnes@gemserve.com for general inquiries and to request application forms and SharePoint spaces. You can read HNES guidance for applicants documents for further detail on the scheme. You can sign up to our mailing list for the latest information and for scheme updates. Also, you can read the optimization guide and watch the videos for tips on how to improve your network. We now have a few minutes for questions. So you now should be able to unmute yourself and ask any questions if you have them.
We have had a couple that have come through already in the Q&A that Sam and I have been responding to. I think I picked up on one of those around the fact that consultants, we don't have a specific set of consultants and people can choose who they would like to go with. We had another question around, can we apply for a SharePoint space now? And as sort of Sam said, yes, you can, but we probably won't be setting them up actually for a couple of weeks, but it's useful for us to have a list of people that are looking to submit a SharePoint space. So we do keep a track of them. So feel free to send an email into the inbox and we'll add you to our list for when we do set them up in a couple of weeks' time. And the final one was around heating system pipework improvements. Are they considered eligible? So yes, basically from within the Energy Centre through to the HRU, it is possible to apply for improvements to pipework. I think the other ones that were in the chat were to do with the dwelling, the number of residents, the number of dwellings, which we've also answered, and whether there's a target payback period that you can look at when assessing capital projects. So we don't have a target payback period. We just look at the grant ask and then compare it with the savings that are being proposed. So I don't know if anyone else has any other questions that they want to ask, either in the chat or by raising your hand.
Another question we get, Louise, I'm going to ask you one instead. If another one we sometimes get is, can we optimize our boilers under the grant on the heat network?
So not directly. So you can't replace the boilers, but you can do particular works potentially around the boilers that can help to improve the efficiency of how they run. So there are elements that you can do within a boiler, but actually replacing the boiler would not be eligible. So it would depend on the extent to which you are essentially through your efficiency works essentially replacing all the component parts, but just not the actual boiler. It would then not be deemed eligible. But if there's a small element that needs to be replaced to make the boiler work more efficiently, then that potentially could be considered. We just can't replace boilers, basically. We've got a question: how many failed applications for capital were there in the last round, and why did they typically fail? For capital, I think typically it is around not necessarily being eligible, so not necessarily aligning with the scheme aims and objectives. They're typically the or the other reason why people fail is not providing sufficient evidence, supporting evidence to allow us to fully have confidence in the costs that they've put forward or the benefits that they're looking to achieve. So I, off the top of my head, I don't know how many failed, but we do have, I think, over the lifetime of the scheme, I think it's probably about a 2/3 success rate of capital projects, I think, that submit. But yeah, typically it's because either they haven't aligned with our objectives around carbon reductions and customers in need, or the supporting evidence hasn't been sufficient. So we have previously suggested to applicants that they go away and reapply in a later round, and we have had people that have done that and have then been successful in later rounds when they've come back with better quality supporting evidence. So yeah, so I would I would recommend making sure that you do have you provide a clear application, clear evidence as to why your network is underperforming, why the measures you're proposing will improve the efficiency, and the justification for the benefits data that you have, all makes our assessors' lives much easier, and helps them to approve applications, basically. Any other questions? One thing I will say, which is a bit of a random plea, but we have had applicants in the past, when they've been completing their application forms, cutting and pasting cells between the different parts of the application form. Please can I ask that you don't do that, because it messes with the formatting of the application form. So just a small plea from me that please don't play with the formatting of the application forms. It's set up for a particular reason from our side. So yeah, please just enter, if you do need to if you do want to sort of copy and paste some information, you can copy and pasting is fine, and then just delete the source data, but please don't cut and paste, because it does cause us some issues. So yeah, a small plea from me there. But yeah, and I think there's another question in the Q&A. I can see a little red dot.
So the question, if you got it, or you want me to read it?
No, I've got it here. Yeah, so it says, considering around 34 million of the total 75 million budget for capital projects has always been awarded, and the timeline of the scheme, could you please clarify if there are plans for additional budget allocations in the future? So I guess that's probably more a question for DESNZ in terms of the fact that they set the budget. We obviously do have more budget available out to 27-28 financial year, and as of yet we haven't opened that financial year up for people to apply into yet. So we do have funding available, but obviously it's a competitive scheme, and there is only a finite budget. I would say that when the scheme launched, we only had about £30 million of capital funding, and because of the success of it, DESNZ did manage to secure additional funding. So the £30 million was just for the 23-24, 24-25 financial years, and then DESNZ were able to secure the additional £45 million of capital funding for the next 3 financial years. So there is a potential that additional funding could be found and could be requested as we go through the scheme, depending on how popular the scheme is and how quickly the funding is used. So I wouldn't ever say that the additional budget couldn't be found, but at the moment the budget that we have is the 75 million.